Right, okay. Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you all. Again, to repeat my apology for those of you that have gone on to have a look at last time's recording on YouTube. I recorded the wrong view, so there's lots of little pictures of all the people at the meeting. This time, I've remembered and I'm now recording speaker view. So you'll have a full view of Judith in all her glory when she gets going. So thank you for your support. We have, as you know, one more session the week after next when we're going to apparently reach the Battle of Hastings. But that's for next time. Bear with me whilst I change over.
There.
Is that right?
Yeah, I centered enough. Yeah.
Do you have a good view of Judy, Jonathan?
No, a little bit low. So you could do with bring the that's better. Oh, up you get.
Any good?
Yeah, yeah, sort of still chinless, but getting there. That's better.
I'm not going to say anything. There's nothing safe I can say. Over to you, Judy.
Good morning, everybody.
I'll get your water.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for being here and being so loyal. I know I say that every time, but I do sincerely mean it. I think it's brilliant that you turn up every fortnight. Thank you. And I hope you're all well.
Thank you.
As we're advancing into the winter, I hope you're all staying well. This period of history that we're just going to touch on now, well, not touch on, we're going to look at this morning, is very neglected indeed. I asked my daughter, who's also got a history degree, hers is from Durham, and I said, did you ever do anything about this? And she said, no. She didn't even know very much about King Canute. It's a sort of thank you, Martin. It's a sort of period of history, really. It's neglected. But I thought we should look at it because we're doing this in the using chronological system. So you can't just leave chunks of history out because there isn't much known about that particular time. So I've called it chaos. I've headed it chaos following death of King Canute because that describes pretty much what happened, that there was chaos. King Canute had brought stability and good government to the kingdom. He'd worked very hard. He and his wife Emma had worked very hard to promote Christianity. You might say, well, it shouldn't have needed promoting, but it did, because many of the Danes and Norwegians hadn't truly converted to Christianity. They'd said they got the land from King Alfred on condition that they became Christians, but there were still elements of pagan belief. And certainly when the Vikings continued to strike this country, there was much damage done to churches and monasteries and religious establishments. King Canute had worked very hard to re-establish the primacy of Christianity. He was a devout believer and he set a very good example, and also a very good example of trying to unite his kingdom, the two ethnic groups, the Danes or the Norsemen and the Anglo-Saxons, and that had worked well. And if you were giving him marks out of 10, you'd say he probably got 8 out of 10 for good governance. It's called good governance and setting a good example. And then when he died in 1035, his work was sort of undermined by the chaos of the succession because an interesting problem arose. Usually the problem was there wasn't an heir. You know, a king hadn't got a successor because he hadn't produced any male children. This problem was too many male children because of marriages and second marriages, children coming from the first marriage, sort of stepsons and stepbrothers and half brothers. There were too many claimants. There were too many children, which is an interesting problem. So we've got a king called Harold Harefoot, who was the son of Canute by his first wife, the one that was discarded so he could marry Emma of Normandy. The reason he could discard his first wife was because they'd married in a pagan ceremony. And so it was it wasn't a bigamous marriage. His second marriage wasn't bigamous. His second marriage was the only true marriage. The first wife was sort of cast aside. Her children weren't cast aside because you know, they were regarded as legitimate and in with a chance of succeeding to the throne. But according to we say the Catholic Church, that was the only form of Christianity in those days in Western Europe. These children were illegitimate because their parents had married in a pagan ceremony. So Harold Harefoot, interesting name. He got the name because he was so swift of foot. He could run really well, but he was also a very fine huntsman. So it meant speedy. It meant he was athletic and speedy. He could run well, and that's how he got the nickname or the name Harefoot. And he had a rival, Canute's son by his second wife, Emma of Normandy. That was a Christian ceremony, and therefore he had, you could say, had priority over his rival Harold Harefoot. Harthacnut was chosen to be King of England following his father, but unfortunately he was abroad. He was in Scandinavia when his father died, and Harold Harefoot decided to challenge his father's decision. The two royal mothers then became involved, interestingly, and it was complicated by Algifu. I mean, what a dreadful name. Canute's first wife, proposing her son by King Ethelred. It's incredibly complicated and ridiculous, all this. He was called
and hard to type.
And Martin said, and hard to type. I mean, what a dreadful name, Algifu. I'm probably maybe not even saying it right. She had a son by King Ethelred, who of course then was of the royal house of Wessex, called Alfred, slightly confusingly. She proposed him as the next king. So we've got three candidates. And then Harold Harefoot showed what kind of a person he was by having this Alfred captured and blinded with red hot irons. Absolutely horrible. And the poor man died of his injuries. They went septic and he died of what we now call sepsis. And his bodyguards were treated in the same way. So a really horrible punishment. Not that he'd done anything wrong, he was just a rival. And Harold Harefoot died in 1040 and was distinguished. I mean, we haven't got, the problem with history so far back is that the source material is limited. And the difficulty is that you maybe only hear one version of an incident, somebody gets an incredibly bad reputation, and historians like to find what really happened and say, well, perhaps this is a very prejudiced account. Perhaps it wasn't quite as bad as they're saying. He wasn't a man of, I mean, he died with the reputation of being a man that acted in bad faith, was vengeful against imagined enemies, that he was paranoid, that he was a vicious swine, basically. But efforts to redeem him or to try and gain a balanced picture of Harold Harefoot have failed, which suggests that he deserves his reputation, that he really was an extremely unattractive character. Harthacnut, which is a funny name, succeeded him in 1040. He was already king of Denmark. He was dismissed in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle by he never did anything worthy of a king while he reigned, which is not a very good write-up, is it? He never did anything worthy of a king. So that needs to be investigated. Why did he get this reputation? Well, one thing, he desecrated his brother's grave. That was a complete no-no in those days. Graves were sacrosanct, or supposed to be. But the main reason, and this is interesting because it chimes in with what's happening now, his short reign was characterized by massive increases in taxation. So our ancestors were very much like us. They did not like to pay their taxes. They didn't like paying taxes at all. They certainly didn't like sudden hikes in taxation. They wanted to know how the money was being spent, what it was being spent on. Was it worthwhile? And the Anglo-Saxons were much more democratic than the Normans were when they turned up. People did have the right to criticise the government. This is why the Victorians liked the Anglo-Saxons. They said they created the basis of Britain's love of freedom and free speech and democracy. That was all down to the Anglo-Saxons. One of their legacies was people talking, ordinary people talking, about what the government was up to or what their king was up to. And I haven't mentioned this before, but the word meeting comes from moot, which is an Anglo-Saxon word, meaning a kind of conference, people getting together. Often by a sacred oak tree, a shire oak. People would meet and the shire would meet. Like obviously a big meeting, a big conference, or they could have a moot, just the village, people getting together and saying, what do you think about such and such? Very interesting. So we do know that there was ordinary people felt that their new king was out of order, putting up the taxes so that he had an invasion force. I would say 62 warships according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So his short reign was characterized by his people, his subjects, having to pay huge taxes because the new king was paranoid about the situation, the succession, and he believed that one of his ambitious half-brothers or step-brothers was out to get him. So he was very paranoid, and that's what they were spending. The extra tax money was being spent on the warships, and then the crew demanded excessive wages which had to be paid, and he also ruled as an autocrat without aid of counsel. Very interesting. In other words, he was like most monarchs of the time, but in Anglo-Saxon England, other monarchs had ruled with counsel. They'd taken advice. Might be wrong advice in the case of King Ethelred, but they had listened to advisors, which is interesting. And if they were sensible, like King Canute, they not only listened, they followed the advice. And this situation was made worse. People started to talk about God having cursed this country, an awful harvest, so that our ancestors were actually starving, not only having to pay excessive taxes, but hungry and desperate. So much so that in Worcester, the tax gatherers were murdered by the townspeople who were starving. And the king then showed that he was like his predecessor, had a vicious way of punishing people who were out of line. And the new punishment was called harrying. the town was burned, the population killed, to teach them a lesson, and as an example to other places that might be thinking they would rebel against the king, or they would rebel against the taxes. So we were a free nation. We were, the ordinary people had the right to complain and say, we can't pay these taxes because we haven't even got enough to eat. Where are we going to get the money from? You know, a very reasonable point of view. How can we pay these high taxes when we haven't even got a decent harvest? We are starving. And other situations that the king dealt with, he dealt with as a tyrant. So it's interesting that all that long time ago, we had a reputation in other parts of Europe for being a free nation with the right to speak up if ordinary people were not satisfied with the way they were being governed. And Harthacnut gained the reputation, which was actually worse than being a murderer, an oath breaker. That was the most dreadful thing in it was a kind of the warrior culture, that if you vowed to be loyal to somebody, you broke your oath, then you were absolutely despicable. It was regarded as being worse than murder. And the way he died was very dramatic, and there's even a picture of it that Martin's found. Harthacnut, who was by this time totally loathed by our ancestors, died at a wedding in Lambeth, so it's very well documented, drinking the bride's health. Apparently he was a heavy drinker anyway, and so he had a stroke. And he'd already named his half-brother, Edward, as his successor. Harthacnut had never married and had no children, didn't have any mistresses or illegitimate children. And that was regarded as a bit strange. We don't know any details, but some people have suggested that he was a sort of closet gay. But you know, that wasn't mentioned at all. But it was rather strange that he'd chosen not to get married. And he died a fitting death, people felt, that it was very undignified that he was at a feast. And he suddenly, well, he didn't die immediately, died of a stroke. It was, the word stroke suggested that God had done it. God had intervened. He died, should have been having a good time. That's why God chose that moment to strike him down for all his misdeeds. So very, very dramatic, and very interesting that the same thing happened to Attila the Hun. He was all drinking and enjoying himself at a feast. When he was struck down, it's sort of seen as God's vengeance on, you know, God is not mocked. God bides his time and then punishes the tyrant. So people were really very happy about the way that Harthacnut had died. They thought it was very appropriate, and that God had a hand in this. It wasn't just that he drank too much and he ate too much and he was an accident waiting to happen, but God had punished him for his misdeeds. But he did the honourable thing and named his half-brother Edward, and that restored the Saxon line of the royal line of Wessex. So we're back to a sort of English royalty. And I've written familiar ground at last, because we've all heard of Edward the Confessor, because we're coming up to the Norman conquest. So he was born in 1003. He was the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. And he was the king's 7th son. As I said, there were plentiful heirs to the throne without the Vikings getting in on the act. And Viking raids meant that his mother and her 2 sons went into exile in France to keep the boy, well, herself safe, but the boys safe. So he grew up in Normandy. And during this time, he became very religious, known for his piety, but convinced that someday he was going to take over his rightful role as King of England. And people have always said, why is he called the Confessor? Some people have said because he listened to other people's sins. He was he had a sort of minor role as a sort of minor cleric and listened to other people confessing their sins. But it's much more likely that he was confessing his sins on a more, well, an extremely regular basis, probably twice a day. And so it was a nickname again. It was because he was confessing so much, constantly confessing his sins. So because he'd been brought up in Normandy, interestingly, he had a Norman attitude to everything. And so his role really was damaged when he became king, that he was pro-Norman. And Norman comes from Norsemen. Normandy had been settled by Vikings who had become Christian and settled in the area now known as Northern France, known as Normandy. There's been a programme, or still is a programme, on PBS on television, which is an American programme that it's British academics talking at the moment about the Normans, because they didn't just live in Normandy, they spread into other parts of Europe. They took over Sicily, for example, set up a very successful kingdom in Sicily. So like the Vikings, they still wanted to expand, they wanted land, but they were a force to be reckoned with in early medieval Europe. The Normans didn't just live in Normandy and then come and take over England. There were Normans all over Europe trying to take over territory, and very successfully taking over territory. So because he had been brought up in Normandy and because his mother was Norman, he was much more, you could say, French than English. And there was a crisis when he became king, from 1050 to 1052, when the king's father-in-law, Earl Godwin of Wessex, remember that the kingdom had been divided into earldoms by the Danish kings, the Norse kings, and Earl Godwin had sort of risen to the top like cream. He was sort of boss earl. The king didn't like Earl Godwin, but favoured his son Harold. And Edward had actually turned against Earl Godwin, who he didn't totally trust. He thought Earl Godwin was very ambitious and was sort of trying to take over the crown. Probably right about that. And he banished Earl Godwin and sent his wife, his own wife, Queen Edith, from court because he suspected that she was, well, not just suspected, he knew that she was on her father's side. Earl Godwin was actually his father-in-law. And he then made the mistake of appointing Normans that he felt he could trust to be in his entourage at court. And he chose Normans as powerful sheriffs. The local government was taken over by Normans, and this caused massive resentment, as you could imagine. And this is when the rumours started that King Edward had actually gone so far as to promise the throne to Duke William of Normandy, because he, King Edward, lacked children. He and his wife didn't have any children. So there's a question straight away, who is going to take over if anything happens to King Edward? And life was so uncertain in those days. People could die at any time of things that we can cure, but they couldn't. So there was this concern that if anything happened to King Edward, would there be chaos again? Disputed succession, lots of people in with a chance. So the succession question really was being considered throughout his reign as an issue. What's going to happen if he's taken from us suddenly, or what's going to happen even if he lives for a long time? Who is going to take over? Hasn't got any children. And there were rumours because people were finding it so irritating and disturbing that he favoured Normans so much, seemed to be ignoring his own people, the Saxons, the English. There were rumours that he had actually named William, Duke of Normandy, as his heir. Now, when you investigate this, there is very little support for this idea, very little written support for this. It's kind of a rumour that began to spread, that he'd nominated Duke William as his successor. And I've actually put evidence is unclear, contradictory, and non-existent. You know, historians have struggled really, really valiantly to find some proof of this. We could say that King Edward's reputation rests on his building, the establishment of Westminster Abbey, something very good that he did. We can't quarrel with that or argue against it. That was something very good that he did. He was an intellectual. He was a bookworm. He wasn't a warrior, although he did lead. Again, he was blamed for never leading his armies into battle, and it's been proved now that he did, and actually did quite successfully. So that was a calumny, that he was absolutely useless and he just sat about reading books and thinking holy thoughts and couldn't lead his army. It's been proved now that he could and did. So this is the problem, that if people get a certain reputation, you suppress anything that contradicts that. If you're saying somebody was really bad and useless, then you don't want anybody saying, oh no, they weren't, they did such and such. You just don't mention that at all. So bias by omission, which of course happens all the time with famous people. You don't want to say anything bad about them to spoil their reputation. So you emphasize all the positives and suppress anything negative about that particular person. So you don't get a balanced picture. So historically, Edward the Confessor comes over as a sort of a bit wet and a bit useless, a sort of dreamy and inappropriate for the times he lived in, that he wasn't a good monarch because needed somebody very, very very positive and dynamic, and with not a scholar, but somebody who could lead an army into battle. But he did build, or see the building of, and supervise the building of Westminster Abbey, a combination of cathedral and abbey, so a centre of learning. So when somebody's called an abbey, it meant it was almost like a little university, and certainly very, very strong educationally, and illustrated manuscripts, etc. So a little powerhouse. It wasn't just somewhere where people worshipped God. It was a place of great industry and tremendous influence, as it has been ever since, although the monastery isn't there anymore, of course. But it was until the reign of Henry VIII, hundreds of years of wonderful work in London. So Earl Godwin came back from exile because the king was becoming more and more unpopular, because he was taking all his advice from his Norman advisors. But the king, interestingly, shows that he wasn't completely prejudiced, because he became more and more attached to Earl Godwin's son, Harold, because he was a successful army leader and he'd acted as the king's deputy. He'd actually defeated a Welsh invasion and incursion in 1055, and he was greatly favoured by King Edward, which shows that King Edward could have been totally prejudiced against him, saying, well, he's my enemy's son, so he's, I hate him as well. He was able to distinguish between the father and the son. He disliked his father, possibly hated him, but could see the advantages and the positive side of his son Harold, and promoted him and trusted him. And at this point, rumours began to circulate that the king had named Harold as his successor. So already we've got a kind of interesting situation. if the king dies, what is going to happen? It looks as though there's going to be a civil war of some sort, or certainly a dynastic contest, a succession dispute, you know, just what everybody wanted. But the final years of Edward's reign, he sort of redeemed himself, although most of it would have happened probably whoever had been king. One of the and he gets the credit for something that was actually nothing to do with him. Improved agricultural methods, an improved form of plough, better crop yields. The population expanded as a result of 1 million, sort of 1 million for the whole country, which is rather an interesting number to consider. Like the whole country, the population was less than Greater Birmingham, spread out everywhere. So tiny little villages and hamlets, but the whole population, 1 million. And that had increased. Taxation was low. So any kings that could provide low taxation, they were popular. Any monarch that kept the taxes down. And the king did, because he lived an abstemious life, because of his religious nature. That was excellent at the time. People admired that. The fact that he was able to keep his expenditure down at court. He didn't have an extravagant entourage. He didn't allow them to be extravagant. He dressed very simply. He expected his courtiers to follow suit. He avoided unnecessary expense on ceremonial occasions, because we think he might have been quite a shy, retiring sort of person. So he didn't spend a lot of money on ceremonial, rich food, collecting. He didn't live in a rich situation in his palace with expensive artifacts and expensive furniture, etc. He lived within his means, and as a result, his popularity grew. As he aged, his childlessness became a problem. People were concerned. Our ancestors were concerned about the future, wondering what was going to happen, particularly as these rumours developed that there were different candidates. You know, he'd promised the crown to different people, that there was going to be, but very likely there would be warfare. There would be a contest. And people are probably wondering how they fitted into this. Would they be called up into an army? Would their land be taken over? Would their homes be destroyed? People feeling very nervous about the future. And then we're on to more familiar ground, because I think we probably did this at school. Events leading to the Norman conquest. So King Edward the Confessor died just after New Year 1066, the 5th of January. That is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And of course, he didn't leave a direct heir or successor. So, just what everybody had been dreading, 4 candidates emerged. So a little bit like the battle for the Conservative leadership. So 4 candidates emerged. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, he'd inherited his father's earldom. William, Duke of Normandy. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway. And then actually the most legally entitled of the candidates, Edgar Atheling. Atheling means young, adolescent, youngster. Edward the Young, great nephew of Edward. So he was the only royal candidate with a claim that was dynastic, that he was of the royal house of Wessex. And their respective claims were based on 3 factors: family ties, promises made to them, and political realities. Family ties. Harold Godwinson was the king's brother-in-law. William of Normandy was a cousin of the king's through Edward's mother, Emma of Normandy. she was William's great aunt. Harold Hardrada had no blood ties, and Edgar Atheling was the last Anglo-Saxon prince alive after his father was killed in 1057. He was Edward's great nephew, so he was of the royal house of Wessex and really should have been the next king if we're just following primogeniture. Promises. And this is the interesting point, if you remember, I'm sure you probably did this at school. Harold Godwinson was trusted by King Edward, as we've said. He hated Earl Godwin, but he died in 1053. It is possible that the king promised the throne to Harold at some unknown point as a safe pair of hands, thinking he was leaving his kingdom to somebody that he knew, he could trust, he'd seen him in action, and he felt that he was the right person. Even though he wasn't royal, he was the right person to whom he could entrust his kingdom and then sort of sleep easy. William of Normandy. In 1051, it is possible that William travelled to England from Normandy to see the king, and on this occasion, William certainly claimed that the king had offered him the succession because he favoured Normans, and this young man had been king since he was 18, even though he's illegitimate. He's the daughter of the son of a tanner's daughter, so his ancestry was dodgy, to put it mildly, but he had proved to be a very effective Duke of Normandy, and it known that King Edward the Confessor favoured all things Norman, so it was quite it did sound quite plausible when William started to say, "Oh, he promised the throne to me." Question then was, can you prove it? Well, no, like word of mouth. But in those days, that was sufficient. A verbal oath was a binding oath. But have you got any documentation to back this up? Well, no, I haven't. But he did promise me it. So the third one, Harold Hardrada, he was King of Norway up to 1046. His father was King Magnus, and he said that his father, King Magnus, had been promised the English throne by the evil Harthacnut. Well, again, have you got any documentation? Well, he had, but it was a forgery, so it's sort of more complicated. And then in 1066, brother Tostig, who is an evil baddie, Harold Godwinson had this bad brother called Earl Tostig, you may remember about him, invited Harold Hardrada to join him in rebelling against his brother because he hated him. So there's sort of like horrible sort of family issues all stirred into the mix. And then Prince Edgar. If we say Prince, it makes that sounds better because he was the one with the legitimate claim. Edgar Atheling. It seemed possible that King Edward had favoured the idea of keeping the crown in the family, you might say, wanting a true Anglo-Saxon prince to succeed him. Two problems. Edgar had been, like the king himself, taken into exile for his own safety when he was very small, a baby. He'd been brought up in Hungary, unusually. He'd been brought up in Hungary, not England. And the other disadvantage was that he was young, hence the nickname Atheling. So the political realities, Harold Godwinson had a fine military record, highly regarded and respected, an experienced administrator, and trusted by all classes of society. Would make an absolutely ideal King of England, in other words, except that he wasn't royal. William of Normandy, what were his qualifications? If you're writing a CV, what would you put? If you're writing a CV for somebody, you try to be positive. Ambitious, experienced, descended from Vikings, that's probably not so good. No stable family, and he had heirs, had children. Harold Hardrada, similarly, what would you write in his CV? Famous, already experienced as a king, had done very well as king, skilled commander, experienced, capable ruler. And then Edgar Atheling, of the true line, so we'll draw on that he was of the royal family, only a teenager to experience and being brought up as a foreigner. So that isn't looking too good. He's not old enough to be king at such a difficult time in our history. And then we come on to much more familiar ground, the Bayeux Tapestry. I think everybody's heard of the Bayeux Tapestry. And it is literally one of the most famous and amazing historical artifacts in the world. A long tapestry. It's actually not a tapestry, it's an embroidery. It's misnamed. It isn't needlepoint, it's not tapestry, it's an embroidery. We'll do more about it next time, but go into detail about the tapestry, because it is a wonderful artifact, a priceless primary source. But of course, we have to bear in mind that it was created by English. It believed it was English embroiderers or broiderers they were called then, that actually created the tapestry, but they were commissioned by the Normans, by the victors, the winning side. So it tells the story of the disputed succession and the invasion from the Norman point of view. You have to be very aware of that. It's a biased document. We call it a document because that's what it is. It documents in pictures the dispute, the resolution of the dispute, the invasion, and the result of the invasion. Ends with the coronation of William as King of England. Can it be trusted as a document? Well, bearing in mind what we've just said, not totally no, because it's telling a one-sided story. It's telling it from the Norman angle. And the two famous scenes before the Battle of Hastings show King Edward promising his throne to William, and then in an even more famous scene, Harold apparently putting his hand on some holy relics and swearing allegiance to King William. Well, it's not King William at that point, but promising that in the future he will accept his rival William as King of England and not dispute the succession, that he will accept King Edward's choice of William as future King of England. And because there's a visual record, people were persuaded, and have been persuaded for the hundreds of years ever since, that this was an accurate visual portrayal of what actually happened. The Chinese have a saying, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Sorry, one picture is worth 1,000 words. And if you see something, then it goes into your brain more than reading about it or being told about it. And in a way, that's true. If you see a picture of something, that seems to resonate. So the tapestry, for many years, until recent years, when historians started to go into things in a lot more detail and sort of investigate a lot more ruthlessly to try and get at the truth, the account shown in the tapestry was regarded as what actually happened. The written confirmation is scanty, contradictory, or non-existent. So it's very difficult to find out what really happened. To whom did King Edward promise the crown? Or did he promise the crown to anybody? He'd just die without having made any provision at all for the future. There's even an argument that's what happened. So what we're looking at, and Martin's found pictures to illustrate this, King Edward died quite slowly. That sounds horrible, but I mean, there's plenty of warning. There are pictures in the Bayeux Tapestry of him on his deathbed. The key pictures, as we said, are well, before we even start about the going back in time to see what happened about the oaths that were taken, just to mention about the tapestry, how very, very skillfully it's been designed. It's a sort of almost like cartoon pictures of what took place. Just to point out, we'll do a bit more about this next time, how very good they were at drawing horses or embroidering horses. The horses are really accurate, and it's a little bit like boys today, often little boys can draw cars really well, or wheeled, anything with wheels, they can draw really well. Not so good at drawing people, because cars mean something. And in those days, of course, horses were the cars, they were the transport of the time. So they could draw horses very well, not so brilliant at drawing people, and absolutely rubbish at perspective, at buildings and furniture. They found it quite difficult to get people to look as though they're actually sitting down. And buildings, the second picture down in your notes, King Edward sitting inside a building, just sort of skimming his head, and there's a big tower at the side which is the same height as the king. They just couldn't do perspective until the Renaissance. So the Bayeux Tapestry, apart from anything else, apart from the historical story that it's telling, is very interesting from the art history point of view. Why couldn't they draw buildings? Why couldn't they get proportion and perspective right? They couldn't. So what actually happened after Edward had died? Did he promise the throne to Harold as he was dying? That's what the tapestry seems to show. King dying, Harold is there. Harold is being told he can be the next King of England. According to William, the crown had already been promised to him. Not only that, the top picture illustrates this famous oath-taking scene. The oath-taking scene is absolutely crucial to understanding the Norman conquest, and the fact that William felt that he claimed he'd been betrayed by an evil oath breaker, that Harold of England, the King of England, because he got himself crowned within weeks of the king's death, that the King of England was an oath breaker and a usurper, and he had stolen the crown from the rightful heir, William of Normandy, because he had sworn an oath on holy relics to uphold William's claim. And that's the scene that Martin's found. The story goes that the English story, the English version, is that Harold was shipwrecked in Normandy. There's dispute about that. Some people said he went on a diplomatic mission. Other people said he went on a hunting or a hawking holiday and got shipwrecked on the coast of Normandy, and there is proof of that on the tapestry. Well, whatever happened, he ended up in Normandy. There's no dispute about that. And while he was in Normandy, he was entertained. He and his servants, his entourage. Harold was entertained royally by William. William was very nice to him, made a big fuss of him, treated him as a nobleman, which he was. He was an earl, an English earl. And then one day, after everything was going well and they were friends, apparently they were friends, William invited Harold into what looks like the throne room, because there's William sitting on what looks like a throne, certainly a high seat. And there was a kind of an altar, a portable altar, which was quite a common thing in those days, so they could have services in different parts of the palace or castle. Possibly even on wheels, you know, a sort of portable altar. A closed box on top of the altar. Would Harold like to put his hand on this box, which was closed, and take an oath of loyalty to William and an agreement that when the king died, which is way in the future at this stage, that when the king died, when King Edward the Confessor died, that William would become king, as he'd been promised, and that Harold would accept that. He promised, put his hand on the box and promised, according to the Norman version of what happened, he promised that he would support William and be loyal to him. He would be his sort of liege man for life and limb. But he didn't know what was in the box. And then when he'd taken the oath, box is opened and holy relics are revealed. In other words, this is the most sacred of sacred oaths that he'd taken, which makes a good story. But there's no proof that this happened except the tapestry. That there very clearly is William on his throne watching, and there is Harold with his hand on the box, taking the oath of loyalty and support. So when Edward died, and Harold very swiftly accepted the fact that he was the heir and got himself crowned very quickly, that was important because he would be also anointed with holy oil, and therefore he would be the anointed King of England, and that was a sort of, again, holy and sacred, and you couldn't go against it once you'd had the holy oil. That wasn't the crown on your head that made you into king, it was the holy oil that made you into the king. So why did Harold do that so quickly? Why did he rush his coronation? Did he know what he'd done? Did he know there was going to be an invasion? Lots of rumours that William was absolutely furious and was building an invasion fleet, or collecting an invasion fleet and building some new ships to come across the channel and take what was rightfully his, and denouncing Harold as an oath breaker and sending messages to England saying, you don't have to, English people, you don't have to support this man. He is evil. He is cursed by God. He is an oath breaker, which is, I've said, worse than murder in those days. If you accuse somebody of being an oath breaker, that was absolutely awful. It's a terrible thing you could say about somebody. So would William, who was very devout in a different kind of way from Edward the Confessor, but noticeably devout, would he have told such a huge lie and risked eternal damnation? We don't know. It's a thought. Would he have told such a lie? Would he have made all this up, that Harold had taken this oath and put his hand on holy relics? It's very difficult to get a hold of the truth. Very difficult to get hold of the truth. But basically, don't totally trust the tapestry, because it is, from the Norman point of view, it is biased. Is it biased to the point where whole episodes have been invented? We don't really know. Investigation over many years in modern times, it just gets more complicated. There's very, very little evidence of this incident in Normandy where Harold is putting his hand on a box with holy relics in it. And if it was a closed box, he was tricked. Why would he need to be tricked? Why would he need to be tricked? There is that big question mark over the whole incident. And the picture of King Edward dying and Harold being there, again, he would have been there because he was an earl. He was one of the top advisors, so he would have been at the king's deathbed. That doesn't mean that the king was offering him the crown. So we've got 4 contenders. We haven't mentioned the other 2. The 2 main contenders, as we remember from school, are Harold, now King of England, previously Harold of Wessex, Harold Godwin's son, now King of England, Harold II, and we've got William, Duke of Normandy, claiming that he's the rightful King of England, and huffing and puffing and making a big song and dance about this is a holy war. We are going to fight against an oath breaker. We are doing God's work. God doesn't like oath breakers, especially if they've sworn something on holy relics. They've offended God. So that was a good point, well made. You know, you're not just fighting for land, you're fighting for honor.
Got to mention the family tree and the
so Martin's found an extremely helpful family tree, Appendix 1, together with pictures. Remember that the pictures are not accurate because they couldn't draw in those days anyway, and a lot of these are later pictures. Later pictures, because people wanted a picture of in their history books, they wanted pictures. The house in Wessex, which is really interesting, showing the descent, and of course our royal family are descended from the house of Wessex. And then Martin's found some brilliant we'll just finish with these brilliant pictures of this incident, which is the only one most people can remember about King Canute. They don't know anything else about him at all. Oh, possibly knows he was a Danish king, but he was the one that tried to make the sea go back or not come in any further and wet his feet, which implies that he was a bit of an idiot, which is very unfair because he wasn't at all. He's one of our very successful kings. But the fact there are all these cartoons means that it's lived on. They lived on in song and legend. That's all people remember about King Canute, and it's a very powerful story, which, as we said before, was misunderstood. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't completely convinced of his own power and might and authority. The whole point about this story is that he was a devout man, God-fearing, and his courtiers were being very sycophantic and sort of toadying around him, saying, "Oh, you're so wonderful, you're so powerful, and so great that even the sea would probably obey you. If you told the sea to go back, it would pay attention to you because you're so wonderful and your decisions are so far." You know, they're really, really flattering him and thinking, there might be promotion in this. If I keep on saying nice things to the king, he might give me an even better job than I've already got. And because he was wise and sensible and practical, he saw through all this and despised it. You know, these people all saying these ridiculous things, and he was offended because he was God-fearing, that they were comparing him with God, saying he got the power to turn the tide back. And so he apparently did order them to carry his throne to the beach, and then they all came and stood and watched, probably feeling very embarrassed by this time, thinking, "Oh, this isn't going very well." And then, of course, he spoke to the knight and said, "Don't come in and wet my feet, because I'm the king. I'm God's chosen. I'm God's anointed. I'm special." So told the tide not to come in, and then of course it did. And then the bits that's left out is he turned to his courtiers and said, "What you said was blasphemy, comparing me with God. You know, don't ever do that again. As you can see, God has the power. I am simply his servant." But the only bit people remember is this man thinking he can order the sea to not come in and wet his feet, thinking he can control the tides. And like the story of Alfred and the Cakes, it sort of resonated with our ancestors, and they sort of the story came down, but twisted, pardon me, twisted out of shape, and giving this very false impression of King Canute as some kind of megalomaniac that really thought that he had power over the tide, and it was exactly the opposite, which shows how things can be misinterpreted and then just handed on as folk history, a folk legend. So, and he's even on this coin. So, £5 coin, amazingly. There's King Canute. But lots of jokes. I mean, these are wonderful cartoons. I've just realised Canute's a nutcase. And another one of him actually being under the sea, actually. And then this one side, the risk assessment people say, "No way," sitting on the beach. And King Canute's immigration policy fails to work. when he's sitting in the sea saying, go back. Interesting that's what people remember. The first page of your notes, a very good illustration of Saxon people and the king on his throne, and it's all the time's coming in and already his feet are wet. A very accurate sort of drawing of Saxon costumes. So next week, no, sorry, not next week, next time, we're going to be on even more familiar ground, because I'm sure you did do this at school. The Great Battle of Hastings, which changed our history, a totally watershed moment, where the dynasty changed. We became a Norman, for a time, a Norman outpost. As I say, they were taking over other parts of Europe, descended from Vikings. So you could say eventually the Vikings did win. They did take over this country and become the new royal family. And I say we're onto more familiar ground with the coming to the throne of William the Conqueror, William I, our first Norman king. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Stay well.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
amazing that you can find such fascinating things to share with us after going through English history 5 times since you started. Thank you very much. We'll gather again next Monday week for the final session before Christmas.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.